Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the continuation of this exposition on Huang Zunxian, who is often regarded as the last great classical Chinese poetry, but also a great advocate for modern Baihua literature. I stopped last time by introducing everyone to the where the Chinese legation. Huang Zunxian was the third member of the legation, the legation counselor, and he came to Japan in December 1877 with the whole legation staff on a ship, the Hai'an, which was moored in Yokohama Harbor. Originally, the Chinese diplomats, and they did bring at least the first two, the ambassador and vice ambassador, brought their families with them. And there was quite a crowd. And they all lived on the ship and intended to do so and conduct business from there, commuting into the downtown area, the palace area, center of Tokyo, using the new rail link. The railroad was already constructed in 1872 or 3, I think, out to Yokohama. But they discovered that this was quite inconvenient and wouldn't work. So Huang was sent into the city to find a place for the embassy to live. Not only did they conduct business in the same place, but they also all lived there. And he found this place in the Yuejie Zhengyuan, or in Japanese Gekkai Soin, the Moon Realm monks' quarters, which was outside the main gate of the great Pure Land Buddhist temple, the Zojoji, the Zhengshansi, in Zhiqu, or Shibaku, which is on the harbor, not very far in those days from the water. And these are photographs that are taken just about the same time that they were there. And the embassy was down at the end of this row of trees, sort of in this area. Here's the main gate, and they were here, down here in this area. Here's the trees, and by 1901, when this schematic topographic map was made, the land had already been sold off and a factory was there, but the graveyard that was attached to the Gekkai Soin is still present, and this is where they were. The Buddhism fell on hard times after the Meiji Restoration. It had been patronized by the Tokugawa shogunate richly for centuries, for the entire length of the Tokugawa rule, but the Meiji cut them off. So instead of having an immense income from land leased out either to farming or to businesses or residential areas, they had to sell it off, and this is one evidence of it. Now, it was so far, it was very close to the water, and so Huang wrote this poem about it, and I talked about it last time, but it's there for you to observe. It's not close to the water at all now because of the landfill over the last 150 years or more. Now, this is an earlier map, and from the Edo period, the 18th century, and I've got it here because in this area here, one of the foremost, one of the most important figures among the Japanese literati, the Bunjin, and a close friend of Huang Zunxian, he lived there. And you can see that the Gekkai Soin is here, or was here at that time. And here's, it must have been 5 minutes, 7 minutes walk between the two. So they became quite close friends. And this man, Ishikawa Kosai, became closely associated with members of the Chinese embassy. And here he is. He was a classical Chinese poetry writer and prose. He helped Huang read Japanese history. He was a prominent Confucian scholar, a Kanchi poet, Kanbun tutor, and he got to know Huang simply by probably showing up one day with some Buddhists from the Zojoji themselves. And for a while, they thought he was actually a Buddhist too, a monk. So they actually gave him a name, Jia Foyin, a false imprint of the Buddha or Buddha seal, as a kind of a joke. Now, this circle of friends put together Ishikawa Kosai edited this. This is Wenda poems, offer and response or exchange poetry. It's a slim volume. It's available like much of the Meiji publications, almost all of them now, I think by now, by the National Diet Library in Japan. They're free for downloading. It's an amazing resource. And this is the cover page of the volume. And these are the people who were involved in it. Hu Zhang and Zhang Sikui, he was the ambassador, the vice ambassador. Shen Wenjian was, Shen Wenying was the another important figure in the embassy. Here was Huang Zunxian. And then these are members of the staff. Now, Ishikawa Kosai, I'm showing you this largely to alert you to the fact that these Japanese scholars were incredibly erudite and were, even Huang Zunxian admitted, they were equal in of sophistication and erudition to Chinese scholars at the time. And this is some of the stuff that he wrote over his long career, both topical things, editing, all sorts of things. Now, he also, this isn't on that list, and I'm putting it here largely for fun, because you'll see what it is. It's the Ye Chuang Gui Tan, or in Japanese, Yaso Kidan, something like at the night window, ghostly talks, or talks about ghosts or demons. It's written entirely in classical Chinese, in Kanbun or Kanwen, and it's it's in the same idiom as Liao Jiazhi Husung Ling's famous collection of stories. And here he is. This actually appears in the third page in the volume itself. He's in his study, supposedly writing the book, and here he is as a much older man. And you can see how the weird stories might be interesting. It was translated into modern Japanese in 2003 and published in Yokohama from Literary Chinese. Literary Chinese, or Kanbun and Kanshi, in Japan have fallen on sad days since the end of the Second World War. It's not part of the school curriculum. A little bit. You get an introduction sort of as a requirement in university arts faculties, but its fate has followed that of Latin in the Western world, or at least in North America, where it's now neglected. When I was a high school student, if you wanted to go to university, you did Latin. So I did 3 years of Latin, but that's long gone. And you can see what kind of stories they were. Pretty good. Okay, now, one of the things that any scholar working on a Chinese poet of any era should do is to try to find out what the man's poetic theory was. And one of the best places to look, if it exists, is the preface to his own works written by the poet himself, where he explains what he's doing, why he's doing it, what authors of the past were important to him, what tradition or traditions of poetry he follows, and so on. Now, the original edition of the Übungszahlschrift didn't have a preface at all attached to it. Now, this is because it was published by the Tongwenguan, the foreign affairs translation, academy, school, college. And I suspect that Huang did not put his own preface there or anybody else's because it was a kind of a public document. He meant this to serve as information about Japan, and the subtext of which, or the strategy involved, was to convince people in power in China, and certainly having something published from the Tongwenguan would have done that, to convince people in China that the Meiji Restoration, the reform movement, the modernization, the incorporation of Western science, technology, and so forth into modernization in Japan was a model for China. So I think rather that he would have avoided that. However, as we see from this preface written in 1885, that he did write this is the right of it. But unfortunately, it doesn't really say anything about his theory of poetry. It tells us, first of all, who helped him read Japanese sources, and he said they corrected, they criticized, they used red and yellow ink, and their corrections overflowed the pages. He went through 4 drafts, and then he submitted it. The Zungliamen, the office in charge of affairs of all nations. This is the Tongwenguan, actually. That's the publishing outlet, which printed it in letter type typography, that is Huoziban. After that, it was published in Hong Kong by the Universal Circulating Herald, the Xunhuan Erbao in Mandarin. This is the newspaper started by Wang Tao, who I could spend a lot of time on too, but we don't have that time. He's considered the founder of modern Chinese journalism, and he also, of course, was the collaborator with James Legge in translating the Chinese classics, and lived in Scotland with the Legges while much of the work was done. And anyway, then it was published again in Japan. Now, it was popular and it sold out, and he had friends when he was abroad give copies to bookstores, and they sold out. And then his father, who went the traditional way of going through the Jinshu exam and then being appointed to officialdom, he was quite an active official even then. That his father then actually had printing blocks carved for it, and where he was serving, and then had it printed. And then he talks about how important his work is, because it takes part in this modernization and in dissemination of information about the new and changing modern world. And he actually composed it on a visit after coming back after Japan. Huang Zunxian went to San Francisco, where he was consul general. Then he went to Singapore, where he was consul general. And then he went to London, to the Imperial Chinese Embassy, as, again, counselor. So he went, as he says, 20,000 li. Well, that's probably an exaggeration, but even so. Now, These are the people who helped him. This is the great thing about working on a later figure in the age of photography. You can actually track down who these people were, you know, a great deal about them and even what they looked like. Now, here's another preface. This is to the 1890 edition, which was revised and expanded from 154 poems to 200. There is some overlap. Altogether, there are 214 poems in that I'm translating as part of this project for Oxford University Press. So this explains how it all got started. During the winter of the Dingzhou year, that's 1877, I followed orders and accompanied our mission and so forth. And he was drafting at the same time his Urban Gojer. This is the first major history, complete history of Japan written in Chinese. He retrieved old accounts and referred to new institutions. And whenever I chose some miscellaneous matter, I always developed a little note on it, which I then linked with a poem. Now, this is interesting. Apparently, he wrote the poems simultaneously with the compilation of this great treatise on Japanese things, the treatises on Japan. It's an imitation of the treatises in the official histories. And then he tacked on a poem. The prose parts came first rather than the other way around. So even though I've been calling them commentaries on the poems, they're essays to which the poems were attached. And I remember when I first encountered this. Now, this is not a collection of poetry to express individuality, inner feelings, his responses to the world, the kind of a exposition of the contents of his consciousness, any of the expressionist, individualist, biographical kind of poetry that we expect from many Chinese poets. But instead they were vehicles of dissemination of information that had a very practical and immediate purpose. And even when I started translating these years and years ago, off and on, I've been working on this since, I don't know, the 1990s. I wondered why in the world anyone would want to render this information in poetry. And the only thing, and I ask views from the audience, my theory is that their function was something like the function of couplets or quatrains that introduced chapters in traditional Chinese novels. It was sort of alerting readers what to expect in the chapter that followed. So it's a kind of a traditional way of engaging readers in a way they're used to. You get a poetic introduction to a prose narrative. Let's talk about that later. That's the only thing I've been able to figure out why he might want to have done it that way. Now, as you can see, his preface is very practical. He complains about the hidebound, sinocentric, traditional view of his contemporaries, and that their ignorance of Japan and how important Japan is. And he went on to say, it's certainly no easy task to talk about how one knows another country. Therefore, when I finished editing this draft, I added these few words to acknowledge my past errors. And he says that he himself was part of this ignorance and hidebound, almost reactionary view of Japan when he first arrived there. And I'll show you what he meant. He wrote in 1879, in the 1879 edition, he wrote a poem about newspapers. He wrote another poem replacing this one in the 1890 edition. And here you see he's quite ambivalent about the value of these things and quite sarcastic. A newspaper appears from the imperial capital. The newly promulgated laws are even more enlightened, and he's being sarcastic there. And old fellows sunning under the eaves chat privately about them. Well, it's, you know, it's 是想谈. Now, 是, you know, I translated it as privately. It also includes the idea of they have no business doing this. It's sort of surreptitiously or, well, we can talk even about that, the implications of 是. Anyway, they chat privately about them, not yet daring to offer their own irresponsible opinions. And the prose essay that follows, and he's saying he's interested in the problem that in the West there are already laws about libel and slander, and I think he's ambivalent about whether or not, you know, this is enforced enough. And then whenever anything new policies present in newspapers, if it's not civilized, Wenming, it's called enlightened, Kaihua. And again, he's being sarcastic and rather critical of the whole process. Now, by the time enough time has passed, he changes his mind completely. If you want to know what happened long ago, read the old histories. But if you want to know what's happening now, read a newspaper. All schools of thought and every thinker are there, not a one's left out, and it reaches everyone everywhere, so all can share the same words. And then he has a very positive take on newspapers in the prose paragraph that follows. But interestingly, he claims that the newspaper originated in the court bulletin, the Dibao, and it even resembles the Collectanea, the Zungshu. If you want to get approval for something new, you got to claim that it isn't new at all, but you can find, you know, precedents for it in the good old golden past. And he's still stuck there. Now, finally, as far as prefaces go, we have to shift to, excuse me, another work entirely. This is the preface to his complete works of poetry, the Renjian Shigao, from the Renjian, the drafts from the hut within the human realm. And here we really finally get what he thinks is important in the Chinese tradition, and lays it all out in great detail. Not only the poetic tradition, but also the kind of general collection of erudition one needs to write proper poetry. And his poetry is very elusive. It's not easy to read. He constantly uses an enormous number of historical and literary allusions. So it's a lot of chasing around and adding footnotes and so forth. Now, this is characteristic of Qing Dynasty poetry in general, and had been going on for a very long time. Another interest of mine is the 17th century poet, scholar, official, Wang Zunxian, Wang Yuyan, who in his own day, people were complaining about him using so many allusions that one needed an enormous library even to figure out what he's trying to say, because you have to track down these allusions to get the drift of the poems. And this carries on. And you can see who's really important to him. In the poets, Cao Zhi, Bao Zhao, Tao Qian, Xie Lingyun, Li Bai, Du Fu, Han Yu, Su Shi, and then extending down to works by later lesser masters of recent times. And he uses this term, poetry for the self, 为我之事, poetry for the self. So it is an expressive, he claims, at least for his own poetry, that has a personal nature, that it is in this tradition, which is largely associated with, though not completely, with the Song Dynasty, looser, colloquial style, heavy on the narrative, and closer to spoken Chinese rather than the highly intricate and difficult tongue syntactical constructions that we discussed last time. Now, here he talks about the Japanese collection, verse tradition, which he was very interested in. And he thought Japanese poets of the Meiji, his contemporaries and a bit earlier, were every bit as good as poets in China, including himself. And he bemoans the fact that people already are losing interest in this. And to sort of highlight this issue, he writes this poem. How many have traced poetry source back to the Han and Wei, and in the wake of the Tang and Song kept the true style alive? No wonder that Korean merchants fought to buy his works, except for Bai Xiangshan, Sui Yuan, that's Yuan Mei, the 18th century poet, is ranked the very best. Now, a great deal can be said about this, and I'll have to abridge everything that's involved here to a few sentences so we can get on with the rest of the presentation. But even though Japan during the Tokugawa or the Edo period, the Bakufu, the Mufu Shidai, even though it had a locked down country policy forbidding Japanese from going abroad and forbidding non-Japanese from entering, with very few exceptions, one being the Dutch in Mijima, anyway, in Kyushu. They're trading ship once a year, but they did allow merchants from Korea, and merchants from Korea brought regularly Chinese works to Japan, especially poetry. It was extremely popular all during the 17th and 18th and into the 19th centuries. And this, so Bai Jui and Yuan Mei were ranked the very best. Now, there is an enormous, well, you can see it's 1,146 pages. This is a history of the reception and influence of Chinese poetry during the Edo period in great detail. This is the work here. And this is just one page, well, it's actually 2 pages of the table of contents, how detailed. Here, interestingly, there's a whole chapter on Wang Shizhen's Shenyun Shuo, his spirit resonance. That's how I've been translating it for years anyway. His theory of poetry and the influence it had on Japanese poets. This is a very rich area to explore. The Japanese poets of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the Kanchi poets writing in Chinese, there are enormous number of them, and they wrote voluminously. To go into, say, the Toyodo, the Dongyang Tang, that's the bookstore in Tokyo, and where they sell such things, collections of kanji poetry that, one is overwhelmed by the amount of stuff on the shelf there. Now, here's some examples of poetry. I wrote a long essay for the journal published by the Royal Asiatic Society in Britain, and some years ago on Huang's attitude towards women, which was quite enlightened for his day. He himself was a Kujaren, he was a Hakka, and Hakka women did not bind their feet, and marriages tended to be monogamous, and he was quite faithful to his wife, refusing all kinds of opportunities in Japan where his Japanese friends tried to get him involved with geisha, and he kept refusing, and he was, well, a thoroughly enlightened fellow in that regard, at least relatively speaking. So he wrote a lot of poems about women and their status in Japan, which was far higher than in China at the time. And here he writes a poem on the opening of the first women's teachers' college in 1876. It opened, and then there was a ceremony each year for the reopening of classes. And he attended one of these. And even though it's retrospective to the year before he arrived in Japan, it seems to have been quite an accurate description of what went on when the Meiji emperor's queen, the empress, paid a visit. And here's rather a kind of he was much taken with Japanese food, and so he wrote about everything from politics, institutions, non-governmental agencies, public space. He was quite interested in parks and museums, all of these things that didn't exist in China at that time. And he even went so far as to talk about cooking. In general, he thought very poorly of Japanese cuisine. He complained that it was not served fresh and hot, but in another poem, he complained that it was always like the Hanshijie, the cold food festival. It was cold food festival, all year long. And then he noted that probably the reason for this was the fact that Japanese cities were full of wooden houses and that everything burned down every once in a while, and probably having fires going was a dangerous thing. And so people tended to be very careful about how much they cooked, and often a lot of things weren't cooked at all. But however, he was much taken with one particular dish, and that's eel, mayu. And here is an example. He really went into, this is one of my favorite poems in the whole collection. I want to taste each piece so much that I stain my fingers and drool. Right, Ranger Liuyan, Gu Chang, right, flavored with blended seasoning and served up with ginger too. Whenever our menus and cookbooks talk about ways to prepare eel, we'll have to amend them to include Edo fragrance, right, Jiang Hu Xiang of the Japanese. And this is what it was popularly called. It's quite an obsolete term now, but apparently this was the way it was described, and places had this out even in front, the eel grilling specialty restaurants. And there's the Japanese term for it. It's grilled over dried rush plants, so it's slightly smoky. and then how it's served. It's still served this way with wasabi or ginger, and so on. And it's interesting now that a lot of eels come from New Zealand and served in Japan. And the New Zealanders started farming eel for the Japanese market way back when I taught there at Auckland University in the 1970s. And it's still a popular thing to do. And there it is. I don't know how close to lunch or dinner everyone is, but there is a final picture. Now, there are a couple of things that I wanted to pick up again from earlier in the presentation. I can direct you to some specific things that you might want to look at because it regards, in particular, the nature and art of translation. I got started with Huang Zunxian back in the 94, 93, because I was asked to do a feature article on Jerry Schmidt's book, Within the Human Realm, The Poetry of Huang Zunxian, which was published by Cambridge. And I was very unhappy with it. And it's very detailed. And review, it's more than a review. I really take him to task for what I consider, his tendency to slide too much into paraphrase and not attempt at all to reconstruct or recover the syntactic equivalence of how it appears in Chinese. Anyway, for more on my theory and the practice of translation, this is a good place to look. And the first of my own essays was this culture of ours, Siwen, or Shibun in Japanese. It centers on the shared high common culture of China and Japan, the ubiquitous kanji culture that then existed and continued to do so well into the 20th century. I've given similar presentations in Japan on Huang Zunxian. I think there was 3, including one to an interesting group in Takarazuka. Takarazuka is a suburb of Osaka. It's a very cultured kind of area, town. It's a fairly large city too, in its own right. It's where the great Takarazuka review. This is where it's a popular cultural place. Anyway, I gave a lecture there on this stuff, and the reaction was rather surprising. These people who attended weren't academics. There are a few, I suppose, but most of them were people in the arts, literature, publishing, newspaper, journalists, intellectuals, certainly. And they found this almost revelatory. It's a part of Japanese cultural history that's largely forgotten in modern Japan. How close high Japanese culture and high Chinese culture, how much they shared a common culture. And in Huang's own day, he and his friends, the Japanese literati, kept referring to it as Siwen. Now this comes from I've translated as this culture of ours. This is borrowed from Peter Bohl. Peter invented the term, or devised the term, goodness, probably close to 30 years ago now. And this culture of ours, it's from the Analects, where Confucius is trapped and it looks like he's going to maybe even be killed And he thinks that heaven won't allow this to happen because heaven wouldn't allow this culture of ours, Siwen, to die with me. So it sort of is a slogan for this great literary culture that began way back in ancient China and spread throughout East Asia. And these Japanese and the Chinese thought that they were sharing the same thing, and they did indeed, because if one looks at the Hitsudan, the Bitan, the brush talks that had been preserved, thousands of pages of conversation among them all, they can right away and allude to, often, interestingly, it's to the Zhuozhuan. They often allude to the Zhuozhuan, both sides, the Chinese and the Japanese, and to make a certain point that it can sum up an issue very quickly in a few words. And so you cite something from the Zhuozhuan. Now, it continues on. This is another one that I published later, which deals with some of the details of this circle of literati on both sides. And then aspects of culture, he explores everything from prisons and the collection of taxes to statistics on the one hand, to, as we've seen, food and restaurants and so forth. And this at Mount Chiba, Just Time for a Laugh. Unfortunately, the magazine Exchange, published at the City University. City University, it's not the Chinese University, it's the City University of Hong Kong, is defunct. It wasn't supported after, I think, 2010. But if you can, I have, by the way, anyone who wants any of these and has trouble finding them, send me an email. It's there at the beginning, at the title of the talk, my address, my email address. I'd be glad to send a copy. And then this one focuses on women. And finally, the whole thing is going to come out in a very large book. I'm obliged to finish it by the end of 2022. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through translating the poems, but there's a very large introductory section still in the planning that deals with the background and especially an analysis of Huang Zunxian and his relation to these Japanese literati. So I think at that point, I would like to stop, and perhaps we can spend more time on this during this presentation to solicit questions and observations from the members of the audience. Can we do that, Mariana?
Yes, sure. Yes, and it might take some time for the questions to pop up. So yet again, if you can't come up with something right away at this moment, we have shared Professor Lynn's contact information, so you can ask the question later via email as well.
Yeah, here it is. And some of these, I can't recall how many are here at ResearchGate. By the way, I have a complaint about academia.edu. I had an enormous trove of stuff up there, and they lost it all. They created a phantom account that had nothing in it but with my name. And so I decided one day, well, let's get rid of it. So I deleted it. It deleted everything. And they said, well, sorry about that. We can't do anything about it. So I said, well, and also I'm really fed up with their continual hard sell to subscribe and get their premium version. I don't know if other people have the same opinion. Anyway, I decided to move everything to ResearchGate, which I find far more congenial. Though they have a fault too. The system continually confuses. If I write a review of something, the author of the work that I review is then confused with a co-author. And then, of course, there are other Richard Lynns in the world besides me. One is a sociologist, anthropologist at the University of Belfast, and another is a marine biologist. They keep confusing this stuff. Oh, life's so hard.
Yes, I believe that many people have problems with academia, and I know that some journals even don't allow people to upload their articles just on this one website.
Yeah.
So less and less people are using it, as far as I know. And we have a question in the chat. I will read it. I have a kind of specific question. I noticed that there are some poems of Huang discussing Japanese language per se. I wonder what's Huang's attitude towards the relationship between classical Chinese, Kanbun, and Japanese language. And could Huang speak a little bit of Japanese?
Probably very, very little. The mode of communication was writing. He would write and they would write, because the Japanese couldn't speak any kind of Chinese either. And the language which they communicated in was a mixture of classical Chinese, Guwen or Wenyanwen, and written Guanhua, the original Mandarin, the language spoken by officials all over China, wherever they were posted. And the Japanese learned this language as a written language, not a spoken language. And they made no attempt to speak it, but they could write it. And this is something that began with the early days of the Tokugawa regime from the early 17th century on. And so they didn't speak to each other, they wrote to each other. And apparently they wrote, it was a very, very fast exchange. Now, the relationship between Kanbun, Kanchi, and any form of Japanese, well, there really isn't any. Well, of course, it's the relationship between the Chinese and the Japanese languages. Up until the end of the Second World War and the complete change in school curriculum during the Allied occupation, everybody learned Kanbun, who had a higher education. And probably as much literature, in the broadest sense of the word, letters, written in Japan from earliest times until then, probably far more than half were written in Kanbun, not in Japanese. The Meiji Constitution was written in classical Chinese. That's an odd fact, but that's, and of course, now classical Chinese has withered away in popular culture in Japan, much the same way that Latin has, at least among educated people in the West. But it's still there, and one can see, of course, and then, of course, you have to know something about Japanese. I mean, the page of Japanese is full of Chinese characters, but they function often quite differently. And there's all sorts of different emphases on meaning. And one interesting thing is that one of the reasons why the Japanese, at least of an earlier generation, were quite good at Chinese pre-modern vernacular literature was that so much of the vocabulary was preserved in Japanese via probably Buddhism, being the Yulu, the Chanshu Yulu, for instance. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's, I think, all I can say about it now.
I have a question, and it will lead us a bit away from the original topic. But I feel like I have to ask because This is a recurring question, recurring topic nowadays for everyone who studies intercultural relationships, and that is the question of, colonialism. So when one culture considers another culture as minor, as barbarian, and so on. And the question is whether you have ever considered this angle, whether you think it influenced work of Huang Zunxian in any way.
Yeah, well, traditionally, Japan was considered a tribute state to China. And the change from that attitude on both sides, rather than a cultural dependent, one of the interesting facets of the Meiji Restoration and modernization in Japan was a break with traditional China and Chinese culture. When I first started working on all this, I had a conversation with my old teacher from Princeton, Marius Jansen, who was a bit dubious that this was even worth doing, because his work with the Meiji era was right in the mainstream of Westernization, modernization. This is the main sort of thrust of early modern Japanese history, and that he regarded Huang Zunxian, and not so much Huang Zunxian, but his associates in Japan as kind of a dead end. They were still kind of enthralled to the past and were being increasingly marginalized and then forgotten. Well, we disagreed, and I continued on with this. But this is an interesting thing. That colonialism is more than economics and politics; it's also cultural. And the Japanese really emancipated themselves from the sense of being a cultural colony of China during the later 19th century and into the 20th. In fact, this Ishikawa Kosai, let me scroll down to one of his works. Where is he here now? Yeah. It's the Qing, 5 things that the Qing Chinese or the Qing court does not understand. Where is that? Can't find it. Well, there is a short little pamphlet he wrote about 5 things the Qing don't understand. The Qing court, the Qingguo, they refer to China and that. And these people that Huang Zunxian had been associating with in 1877 to 1882, these cultural conservatives and traditionalists, who were quite sympathetic and positive about China, completely changed their minds with the failure of the 1898 palace coup in China, where the Empress Dowager put an end to the reforms and actually had many of the leaders, Tan Se-tung, for instance, and so forth, that caught and executed. And that was a big turning point in Japan. Their attitude changed rather completely, some of them. And the issue was largely encapsulated in one particular attitude that became very, very dangerous. The attitude was, now that China has had this reactionary coup and has rejected modernization and all the things that the Meiji Japanese are embracing, they no longer are capable of taking care of themselves. So we have to do it for them. And this was the beginning of Japanese attitude of aggression and occupation of China, and so much suffering inflicted on China during the 20th century. And it began back with the failure of the 1898 reform movement of the Guangxu Emperor and his supporters. So yes, issues of colonialism and politics are very, very important and related to all this.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone that questions can be very trivial as well and don't necessarily have to be about Japan or Huang Zunxian. It can be about translations of poetry, reference books, methods, and so on. Okay, and while everyone is silent, could you please share with everyone which is your favorite dictionary? Which dictionary do you use the most while translating poetry?
Oh my. I use a variety of things. I go to the Hanyu Dazidian quite often, the online version. Probably first. But the real fallback when I can't find a term is the Daikan Wajiten, the Da Han He Zidian, the great Murahashi compendium. So I recommend that. It's 12 volume. Actually, there's a 13th volume with an emendation published more recently. That's what I use to really track down difficult stuff. It's very useful to, especially as I mentioned last time, for people like me who started to learn Chinese only as a young adult, not as a child. And there are ways we supplement these deficiencies. And one of them is Japanese reference works. They're very, very useful.
Could you please elaborate a little on Huang's attitude towards women? Thank you.
He was, on the one hand, surprised at the public presence of elite women from elite society. They had far more of a public presence in Japan than in China. The collection of poetry in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society deals with a lot of these things. I recommend taking a look at that. He thought it was really great that public education was offered, first of all, that there was public education at the elementary level in those days only, but still it was public and universal in Japan, and that this was offered to both boys and girls. He thought this was an excellent idea. He also looked at the dark side of women's existence in Japan, prostitution, the entertainment industry in general. And he likened it to that of China and pre-modern China. And he often used traditional forms of poetry. That's the theme of the neglected and abused, maltreated, sing-song girl in the Chinese tradition. That this happened also in Japan, and he thought that was pretty awful. And so he explored both the good and the bad side of the status of women in Japan while he was there. And his progressive views, well, I don't know what happened. He didn't live that much longer. And well, he died in 1905. In 1898, he was in Beijing. He had actually arrived there to be to have an audience with the Guangxu Emperor. He was going to be appointed ambassador to Japan. But this happened just before the coup, and he was hunted down, or hunted, like all the other progressives associated with the reform movement. But he was hidden in the home of a Japanese diplomat until the worst of the purge was over. And but then he was told to go home to Meizhou in Guangdong, and just stay there and not get involved in politics ever again. And he died just what, 6 years later, 7 years later.
Okay, thank you. And there is a follow-up question, though perhaps there is no definite answer. Did elite Japanese women or those in school learn Kanbun in Huang's day? Also, about readership of Huang's poetry, did women have access to it?
Sorry, the last part?
Did women have access to his poetry?
To Huang's poetry?
Yes.
Well, there was a high degree of literacy among educated people, including women in Japan, and many were poets themselves, waka poetry, hege, Japanese style poetry. And of course, there's a long tradition of literacy. The first novel, the Genji Monogatari, the Tale of Genji, was written by a woman. That's in the 10th century. Elite women in Japan did rather well. Not so well under all the military shogunates, but there are many Japanese women who were involved in the reforms and the development of modern education in Japan. I write about this to some extent in that Royal Asiatic Society Journal issue article. I don't know what the curriculum was for the women's teachers college. I would assume that they would have to read Kanbun material because there was so much of everything was being still written in it at that time, and continued to be so into the 20th century. And there were already Japanese women writers involved with Meiji development of modern fiction, short stories, journalism, and so forth. So there's lots going on for women then in the Meiji era.
Thank you. And I'll allow several more minutes for people to come up with new questions. And meanwhile, let me advertise a bit. So starting 7th of October, we will be starting a new thematic block in Methods of Sinology. And it is called Working with Manuscripts. So we have two wonderful speakers for that block, which is Zhou Boqun and Imre Galambos. And they will talk about studying early Bamboo texts and medieval manuscripts. So all are welcome to register for that. And please just pay attention that two first lectures by Zhou Boqun are going to be 2 hours earlier than usual. Yes, and the link to the registration is in the chat. A question for me this time: will future talks be also accessible online too. Our plan is to record all of the lectures, and they will be posted on the event pages on the website, just like with this lecture. It is also recorded and will be posted. But please understand that some of the lectures might not agree to record the lectures, so we can't promise that everything will be recorded. Let me see.
Perhaps if I made a few general remarks about Japanese sinology, would that be appropriate at this point?
Yes, please, please. It would be really interesting.
During the 1960s, when I was preparing my PhD, it was the, sorry, I should turn this off. It was, well, I'm a dual citizen of the US and Canada, but at the time in the 60s, I was a US citizen only, and there was no way I could go to mainland China. And anyway, it was the Wenhe Dagaming, and there was, the universities were closed, libraries were closed, and there didn't seem much point in going there anyway. So what does one do for language training in those days? So I went to Taiwan, to the Inter-University Center administered then by Stanford University, which was on the Taida campus, the National Taiwan University campus. But another thing that many people, my contemporaries, did was to go to Japan, in particular to go to Kyoto, to the Humanistic Sciences Research Center at Kyoto University, the Jinbun Kangaku Kenkyujo, the Renwen Kusha Yenjoso. And the whole generation of which I belong did that. So we got a lot of our training from Japanese scholars. And they were rather great scholars. The people there at the Jinbun, which we call the Renwen, for short, the Jinbun, was Yoshikawa Kojiro, Tanaka Kenji, Iriya Yoshitaka, and people like that. The erudition of these people was considerable. I also enjoyed working there because in those days my Japanese wasn't all that good, but all those Japanese professors all spoke beautiful Beijinghua. They had all been trained in the old days, and in those days Beiping, and they could speak Chinese wonderfully. So I could speak Chinese, which I found easier then. By the way, about the quality of poetry written by Chinese poetry. Yoshikawa Kojiro published his collected Chinese poems after he retired. I guess he was in his early 70s then. And he gave a copy to my own teacher, Liu Royu. And this was after I'd come back to the United States and was at Stanford. And so I asked Professor Liu what he thought. He said, "Oh, they're very, very good." So the quality of engagement with Chinese high culture by these people, and Yoshikawa Kojiro, he was a 20th century figure. a generation and a half at least later than Huang Zunxian. Well, anyway, we people of that, Wildidema is another contemporary who got trained in Kyoto. Jonathan Chaves is another one. Jean-Francois Billeter, who was at Geneva for many years, did the same. Though Jean-Francois was quite interesting because he had just come from China, where he had gone through a lot of the Cultural Revolution, and then came out to study in Kyoto. Anyway, the requirements in those days also favored learning Japanese sinology. We were required at Stanford for the PhD to do 3 years of modern Japanese. I don't know if that requirement is still in place, but it proved very, very useful. And of course, it's a way for non-Chinese who don't get a traditional Chinese education, in effect, a leg up, a kind of a boost to kind of catch up with our Chinese colleagues in how to deal with this immense literary tradition. There's a certain control that the Japanese have over it that I think many would find quite useful. I remember discussing this with Donald Holtzman, who also learned most of his sinology in Japan in the late 40s and early 50s. And Holtzman said, well, the Japanese study Chinese the way we do it, only they're much better at it. Those are some general observations. And I'm glad to see that many young Chinese scholars are getting PhDs in Japanese universities. They're getting jobs in Japanese universities. One of our closest young friends is Tong Ling at Nanjing Daxue, who specializes in Nanbeichao literature and literary theory and poetry. He had a wonderful experience in Kyoto, and now he is making his mark on that particular field. And Huang Zunxian has been well studied in Japan, but he also is studied quite often in China for various reasons, both connected with Japan and with the modern literary movement. Ironically, Huang promoted Baihua literature, but he did so entirely in Guwen. He didn't write it in Baihua himself. And then don't forget, or if you don't know, when it was still Hangzhou Daxue, and now that's the amalgamated Zhejiang Daxue, there was a group quite active in studying Chinese-Japanese cultural relations, and they published a large series in the 1990s and early part of this century, works on all aspects of Chinese-Japanese pre-modern and early modern cultural relations. Well, there.
Yes, thank you. And there is one more follow-up question, and I think this will be the last for today. Please, has Huang expressed his views on women, Japanese or Chinese, writing poetry or literature? Thank you.
No, I don't know of any. I think in some of the prose parts of the poems where he deals with the Japanese tradition of Chinese poetry, a few kanshi women poets appear, but they just appear in a list. But he doesn't say anything about them. These are long lists of the important poets through time, especially those of the Meiji era. But he doesn't say anything about them in particular, alas.
I suggest we end here. So thank you everyone for coming. And special thank you to Professor Lynn, who agreed to give 2 talks for us. And see you hopefully in October.
Thanks to everyone for attending, and thank you for the questions. And I hope that things I've said might be useful to you, at least interesting occasionally.
Yes,
Okay,
they were.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.